Without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to E.K. Tan. He is the Associate Professor of Comparative Literature and Phone Studies in the Department of Asian and Asian American Studies here at Stony Brook, and Nerissa's chair. We always give our chairs the opportunity to speak about the work, the wonderful work that the fellows are doing when they're here in the Humanities Institute. Let me get him up on screen. There he is. EK, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Adrian, for inviting me. I'm here as a proud chair for Nerissa, because she's giving a talk based on something that she proposed for the faculty fellows last year with the Humanities Institute. So I'm going to give a quick introduction to her before we give the time to her to share with you her research. Nerissa Balce is Associate Professor in the Department of Asian and Asian American Studies. She was born and raised in Manila, Philippines. She received a BA in Literature and an MA in Philippine Studies from De La Salle University in Manila. Her PhD is in Ethnic Studies from the University of California, Berkeley. She's the author of the book Body Parts of Empire, Visual Abjection, Filipino Images and the American Archive, published by the University of Michigan Press in 2016. The book won the 2018 Best Book Award in Cultural Studies from the Filipino section of the Association for Asian American Studies. She's also the co-curator of the online art project titled Dark Lens, Lente ng Karimlan, the Filipinos' camera in Duterte's Republic. So I hope I read that correctly, Lente ng Karimlan. All right, Nerissa can correct me later. An online exhibition of Philippine photographs and injustice and loss featuring commissioned poems and captions by 40 scholars and artists from the Philippines and North America. Her talk today, titled Beyond the Atrocity Photograph on the Decolonized Eye and Filipino Images, is related to this art project, but is actually a part of her book in progress. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Nerissa Balce and her talk. The time is yours, Nerissa.
Salamat, Ike. Thanks for introducing me and for the kind words and for always supporting me as department chair and my former writing partner. But anyway, that's another story. But salamat, Ike. I wanted to greet everyone this afternoon in Filipino, magandang hapon. For friends in the Philippines, magandang umaga. I know that it's morning, Wednesday morning in Manila. So I wanted to share my screen and we can start. Okay. So my talk today must begin with a few care warnings. This photographic essay is part of an anthology of essays on Philippine photographs in the time of the Duterte regime. But this is also going to appear in my solo authored book. Parts of this talk previously appeared in different publications and platforms, such as the online art project Dark Lens, Lente ng Karimlan, the art project mentioned by Dr. Tan. And this was an art project that I began in 2018 with my co-curators, Dr. Pia Arboleda from the University of Hawaii, Manoa, and a dear friend, Manila journalist, Francine Marquez. The talk also appeared in Verge Journal, the Asian American Writers Workshop website, and the upcoming anthology, Filipinx American Studies, edited by Rick Bonus and Antonio Tiongson Jr. I have to warn everyone in the audience that I will discuss violent histories and I will show some difficult images from the Philippines, since the topic of my lecture is what media scholars call the atrocity photograph. an image of extreme violation against a human body. The atrocity photograph records violence as it happens, or after, or even just before. However, I want to make the case for seeing the dead in Philippine atrocity photographs as a way to understand forgotten, occluded, or hidden histories. I will argue that contemporary drug war photographs are the after images of empire, and I will say more about this in a bit. I am aware at this moment my immigrant community is in pain. While the pandemic has claimed more than 980,000 lives in the US, Filipino healthcare workers have suffered greatly. While Filipino registered nurses in the US account for only 4% of all nurses in the country, nearly a third of all COVID-related deaths among registered nurses are Filipinos and Filipinas. There's also the ongoing hate crimes against Asian immigrants happening in New York City and elsewhere around the country. Just this past week, as documented by Father Julian Hagodilia, Executive Director of the Migrant Center of New York, he noted that a 73-year-old Filipino was assaulted, a 53-year-old Filipino was beaten unconscious and robbed, and a week before, a 67-year-old Filipina was punched more than 100 times by an assailant, beaten as she was on the ground. Then, of course, there is the topic of my talk today, which is on the Duterte regime, which is a regime of violence. My lecture argues for the need to look at atrocity photographs through the lens of history. We live in an age of atrocities, what critic Ariela Azoulay describes as man-made and regime-made atrocities. Our digitally connected lives in this white settler colonial nation demands that we learn how to read such images critically. So why look at atrocity pictures? I will argue that these images are visual texts on empire and fascism. The photographic images we will view are visual texts connected to the history of the United States as an empire in the Asia Pacific, and the role of US military support for dictators like Ferdinand Marcos. There is also, of course, military support for the Duterte regime. For more than a century, since the military occupation of the Philippines in 1898, American tax dollars have supported the Philippine military and the police. So if one chooses not to look at these pictures of US-sponsored atrocities, one refuses to learn what Filipino-American novelist Gina Apostol describes as our haunted history. So this is a quote from Gina Apostol. The Philippines is haunted by its relationship with the United States. Our spectral angst is not so immaterial. Our dread is drenched in military dollars and haunted by civilian blood. And this is from her opinion, her op-ed, which is entitled, I think, In the Philippines, Haunted by History. And it appeared in the Times in 2012. To understand the political and cultural issues of Filipino immigrant communities, we must turn to our intimate and imperial ties with our former colonizer. The Philippines is haunted by the history of war and military occupation by the United States that began in 1898. The Filipinos' spectral angst, however, as Apostol put it, is not so immaterial. The material or concrete basis of our relationship with the United States was our status as a former US colony in the Asia Pacific, made possible by the little-known Philippine-American War of 1899 that claimed more than 4,000 American soldiers' lives and a million Filipino deaths. And the number for the deaths during the Philippine-American War is still being contested. There's a lot of discussion about whether it was more than 200,000 or close to 1 million deaths. Philippine-American relations is indeed drenched in military dollars and haunted by civilian blood. So in 2016, the beginning of Duterte's tenure as president, I began to pay attention to Duterte's language of death. It was also that year that I lived in the Philippines for 9 months. While there, I would read the Philippine news with anger. And to this day, I really do this, I automatically curl my hands into a fist whenever I hear Duterte's voice or see his face on TV or on my laptop. Duterte's term will end this May 2022, but his daughter, Sara Duterte, is running as vice president and is the running mate of Ferdinand Marcos Jr., who is running for president. So the possibility of Sara Duterte and Bongbong or Ferdinand Marcos Jr. winning this May is something that causes anxiety and anger for me yet again. But anger is certainly a proper and an ethical response to Philippine oligarchy and the continuation of fascism. And anger, as feminist, queer, and immigrant rights activists have shown us, is also a fuel for organizing or joining a movement. In my case, anger brought me to join and volunteer for Malaya, New York, an organization for human rights and justice in the Philippines. The Black feminist writer Audre Lorde reminds us of the uses of anger, how anger can also be useful for survival, for demanding justice, beauty, hope, and life. Lorde writes that anger can offer, quote, illumination, laughter, protection, fire in places where there was no light. I hope that this lecture on the decolonized I might help illuminate ways of seeing, ways of knowing, as well as ways of organizing against violent leaders. So for the remainder of my time, my talk will be divided into 4 parts. Part 1 examines the work of the dead, in particular images of dead Filipinos from the Philippine-American War of 1899. Part 2 is a brief discussion on Filipino atrocity photographs, and you'll see some of the images from Dark Lens, the online exhibit that I co-curated. Part 3 is on the decolonized eye, or ways of seeing Philippine atrocity photographs from Duterte's drug war. And part 4 concludes with digital images and documentaries as the after images of empire and fascism. And part 4 includes both fiction and then some images from documentaries. So part 1, work of the dead. In 2017, a book by historian Thomas Laqueur, I think it's Laqueur or Laqueur, I'm not sure, but I have a Filipino accent, so I'm going to say Laqueur. Thomas Laqueur's book caught my attention because of its provocative title, The Work of the Dead. I purchased Laqueur's 711-page study, hoping that his ideas might help me make sense of the hundreds of images of corpses that I was seeing online at the time, in Philippine newspapers and on Facebook. The dead were victims of President Rodrigo Roa Duterte's so-called drug war to end illegal drug use and his claims of an alleged drug trade that was destroying the Philippine Republic. The new Philippine president believed that criminals such as drug users and drug pushers were animals who should be killed without due process. Duterte encouraged the police to shoot them dead, as that's an actual quote from Duterte. And he bragged that he would protect the cops who followed his presidential policy of state-sanctioned killings, or what we call, or what is known as extrajudicial killings. Since its unleashing, Duterte's drug war has claimed more than 30,000 deaths, with more than 40% of the killings committed in Manila, the Philippine capital. And scholars have described this humanitarian crisis as a genocide of the poor. Most of the dead are from urban slums, men, women, teenagers, and children who were shot or killed in the crossfire. Their bodies found in sewers, on dimly lit side streets in busy intersections, by sari-sari or corner stores, and in jeepneys, tricycles, and cars. Some of the corpses bear the marks of torture, some with their heads wrapped in duct tape, so that identifying them has been impossible. Corpses have been found with handwritten signs in Filipino that say, "I am a drug pusher." Since the drug killings, a new generation of Filipino photographers in the tradition of journalists during the Marcos dictatorship have emerged to record the horror of the Philippine state. For this talk, we will see some of these photographers, and these are Eloisa Lopez, Brother Siriaco or Brother June Santiago III, Ezra Akayan, and Rafi Lerma. The new photographs of the drug war return us to the camera's old intimacies with death and state violence. And the slide you're seeing is actually a colonial photograph that I sort of superimposed on the slide. And these are ordinary photographs that you can find on the Library of Congress website, and also old historical books that are on sale for $15 or $20 on Amazon and I guess eBay. Is eBay still around? Anyway, eBay, okay. Anyway, so the new photographs of the drug war return us to the camera's old intimacies with death and state violence. The photographs of extrajudicial killings, what Filipinos refer to as EJKs. I don't know why Filipinos always refer to acronyms. Is it a way to distance yourself from the horror? Maybe, but this is how we refer to extrajudicial killings, as EJKs. The EJKs appeared not only in print, but also on social media, thus expanding the reach of the photographs to millions of Filipinos and by extension, a global audience. And when I say that it reaches 1 million Filipinos, it has to do with the fact that Filipinos are one of the most common users of Facebook, because the Philippines is a poor country. Most Filipinos use Facebook as a web browser, or basically the internet, as well as our source of the news. Then of course there is the fact that there are probably more than 10 million Filipinos living outside of the country as immigrant or migrant workers. So the reach of photographs by the photographers of the night shift, as they're called, has been helped by social media. And they have different nicknames. One of them is the night crawlers, photographers. Some of them don't like that. But certainly because they were assigned to the night shift, they're also called the photographers of the night shift. So sometimes I use both these terms. So what is life like for these photographers? Their grueling schedules begin at nightfall. They rush to the site of a murder or multiple murders, hurrying to photograph the corpses in the dark before the police take the dead to morgues or funeral parlors that charge the victim's family tens of thousands of pesos, with a significant cut for the police who give business to these morgues. These are near impossible working conditions: low lighting, the smell of blood, sewage and fear, and the hostility of some Philippine police. But they continue. These photographers continue to share photographs of the EJKs or the extrajudicial killings on various media. And a good thing is that they've also won international accolades for their work. Going back to Laqueur, sadly, Laqueur's historical study, with its provocative title, The Work of the Dead, had little to say about photographs of the dead of a formerly colonized country. Laqueur's book was largely a study of European and in particular English practices of burying, recording, and counting the dead from the Enlightenment to the 20th century. His study did not deal with the messy and disturbing business of the British Empire, while Laqueur claims that his book examines how the dead make civilization with their historical, philosophical, and anthropological weight, and that's a quote from Laqueur, he curiously avoids the colonial dead. The Indians, Africans, Irish, Scots, Pacific Islanders, and other indigenous or First Nation peoples subjected to British rule and violence. Laqueur's silence on the colonial and slow violence committed by the British Empire during its 400-year reign, borrowing a phrase from King Kok Chung, is unarticulate silence. And what you're seeing here are not the colonial dead of the British Empire. These are Filipinos, and these are stereo cards from the Philippine-American War. So my point of showing these postcards is to think of the work of the colonial dead. I think the work of the colonial dead, the millions killed by genocide, famines, land theft, the destruction of settlements and kinship networks, those killed by military occupation, the enforced forgetting of indigenous languages and ways of life, ecological destruction, etc. All this, the colonial dead, messes up the elegant narratives of empire. In effect, the colonial dead would mess up the neat narrative of Laqueur. Here, I'm thinking of the decolonial project of Black feminist studies, Filipino studies, and ethnic studies scholars who demand the recognition of the colonial dead, rendered invisible by the imperial idea we know as man, or the universal man. As Black feminist scholar Sylvia Wynter put it, the arrival of Columbus in the Americas in 1492 and Leonardo da Vinci's iconic painting, The Vitruvian Man, were the historical landmarks in the creation of human inequality and the beginning of ideas and sciences that promoted race and racism. To put it in another way, the moment of the creation of European conceptions of man became the moment of the creation of man's racial and gendered inferiors, bodies that would later be recorded by the Western camera in pain and in death. A technology that recorded the colonial dead through images of racial violence and beauty is the American camera, and these are examples of that on the slide. In my first book, Body Parts of Empire, Visual Objection, Filipino Images, and the American Archive, I discussed how the American box camera, popularized by companies like the Kodak Company of New York, facilitated the creation of mass-produced images of Filipino death after 1898. Historically, the earliest American photographic images of the dead were from the Civil War. The corpse of a Union soldier slain on the battlefield was a meaningful and romantic image in the 19th century American imagination. For much of Civil War photography, images of dead white soldiers taken after battle were not scenes of atrocity, but were in fact scenes of sacred scenes, sacred or shall we say sacral or highly religious scenes of American nationhood. As the late historian Alan Trachtenberg reminds us, quote, the Civil War transformed the savagery of war, in particular the nation's memories of the deaths of hundreds of thousands of mostly white American soldiers, into martyrdom and the sacred. So violent war photographs ironically preserved the peace of mind of white middle-class Americans. It was during the Indian Wars of the late 19th century that American stereo cards and postcards featured images of new dead bodies, Native Americans. The face of death, particularly the face of the American nation's enemy, was now a brown face, the quote, savage nation, the savage enemy's face. Since the early explorations of the New World, Westerners have recorded images of native peoples for purposes that ranged from the anthropological to the romantic. But it is historical violence that defines the image of Native Americans in the American imagination. By seeing Indians as dead enemies, American victory was understandable and Native deaths acceptable, at least for some Americans of the 19th century. It was the period of the Philippine-American War from 1899 to 1902 that a generation of Americans saw photographic images of new dead enemies, the Filipino insurrecto, or the Filipino insurgent at war with the US Army. Presenting Filipinos as dead enemies was important for creating consent and visual propaganda for the violent occupation of the Philippines. During the Philippine-American, there's the photo. That's the slide of Tomas Laquer, so sorry about that. That's what I wanted to show. But let me show you that and we will move along. Okay. During the Philippine-American War, companies such as Underwood and Underwood, Keystone, Kilburn, and H.C. White sold images of dead Filipinos after battle with the US Army. Such war scenes were not only popular entertainment, but educational. Public schools around the country bought box sets or stereo views sold in special containers as a unit. By 1901, Underwood and Underwood was producing and selling almost 25,000 stereo cards per day. Thousands of sets were sold to schools, public libraries, and large churches for Sunday school lessons. In 1924, the Keystone Company produced sets of 1,000 stereo views with accompanying handbooks. These visual aids were seen by a generation of American children, and they saw postcards that you just saw. They were shown in schools as well as in churches. The Philippine-American War claimed more than 1 million lives, but remains a largely forgotten war. The War of 1899 was a violent, costly, and controversial war, marked with scandals of the torture of Filipino civilians and massacres such as General Jacob Smith's orders to kill any Filipino, quote, over the age of 10 years old. But the historical amnesia that surrounds the Philippine-American War was made possible by the American camera. Thousands of stereo cards of the Philippine campaign and books like this book that you see, Fighting in the Philippines, took part in the ideological work of presenting the war against the Filipinos as a just and winnable war. As Filipina art historian Marian Pastor Roses put it, she says, quote, "It was the Americans, however, who jettisoned all the mythic subtlety about the link between photography and power. To them, the camera was outright, upfront, no nonsense, standard predatory equipment. War was a sensuous adventure that must be glorified in pictures." Popularizing a winnable war in the Philippines required images such as the ones we saw and new ones we shall see in a bit. For many Americans, the image of enemy corpses produced an imperial pleasure that helped manage the nation's fear of losing the war, similar to the peace of mind offered by the Civil War photographs of dead Confederate soldiers. Seeing dead Filipinos at the turn of the 20th century was part of American visual culture. American publications like the book Fighting in the Philippines was readily available. And of course, stereograph companies sold photographs of dead Filipino amigos, using the phrase as a caption for stereoscopic cards. The Filipino cadaver, whether a rebel soldier or a civilian, became a sign of American nationhood and victory. So these are all some images from the book Fighting in the Philippines. Now, what you see from this book gives us a sense of how it was very ordinary and it was very accessible for middle-class Americans to see images of the Filipino dead. During the Philippine-American War, popular war books such as these were available for middle-class Americans to take part in what was called the Philippine Campaign or the Philippine Insurrection. Buying illustrated books or photo books about the insurrection was a patriotic act. But what also occurred was the act of selling atrocity photographs for the purpose of empire building. So now we move to the Filipino atrocity photograph. A century after, the camera continues its role as a recorder of atrocities. A common understanding of the term atrocity refers to a violent action on the human body that causes death, torture, amputation, burning, or the desecration of a corpse. And the etymology of the term suggests its meaning. The root word is atrox, Latin for cruel or fierce. Atrocity photographs are thus images of cruelty inflicted on others or the pain of others. Critic Ariela Azoulay observes three characteristics of the conventional atrocity photograph. So one is that the photograph has to intentionally show an image of a human body in pain or in death. Two, the image is something horrific and made public. And three, the photograph shows something that could have been prevented if the law or society's moral norms were followed. In the 21st century, photography and atrocity are in crisis. As of the moment, the world is witnessing multiple mediated atrocities. The photographs and videos of Bucha, Ukraine are recent examples. Critic Jay Prosser argues that as of this moment, quote, what gets named as an act of atrocity and what we should do about it complicates every representation of atrocity, end quote. He adds that photography is also in crisis because of the digital creation and circulation of images. Also, there is the reality of the corporate ownership of media. Then there is embedded reporting and the censorship of the government's army, and citizen journalists who record events with their own phones. But we could also view these very conditions outlined by Prosser. We could view it differently when we consider the situation of the Filipino photographers of the drug war. And so now we're going to transition, and a care warning, you're going to see images from Dark Lens. And here we transition to images from Dark Lens. And you can view photographs of Dark Lens and the captions written by 40 scholars, artists, and writers from North America on the website of the Stony Brook Center for the Study of Inequality, Social Justice, and Policy. Or you can just Google Dark Lens Duterte. Thanks to the digital circulation of photos, the world is able to see the horror of the Philippine state that would have been impossible 25 years ago with analog media. With the ubiquity of smartphones and laptops, night shift photographers were able to post and share their work with an international audience on Instagram, Facebook, and other platforms. Filipino journalists have been able to share both their photographs as well as their own captions. So in place of the genre known as the photographic essay, something I'm writing here, in place of the photographic essay, social media now enables photojournalists to write their own version of a capsule, or what we could consider as a mini photo essay. A photojournalist doesn't have to collaborate or work with an art critic or a writer for their images to appear in magazines or newspapers. The photojournalists themselves can frame and interpret their photographs with their own point of view. Photojournalists can also choose to reveal as little or as much as they want about their photographs, such as dates, the names of the subject in the photograph, the location or where they took the photo, etc. And all this is especially relevant to the photographers of the night shift, since some of their subjects, some of the people they photograph would prefer anonymity for their safety. While media and art study scholars have written on photographs picturing atrocity, I turn to Philippine photography's relationship to the violent state. Seeing the Philippine police and military as death-making institutions follows abolitionist activist Mariam Kaba's work on the abolition movement and the prison industrial complex. I argue that images of the Philippine drug war are ways of seeing the Philippine state and the violence of Duterte's fascism. Since December 2018, debates about whether Duterte is a fascist or not are over. That's long, that ship has sailed. But for a while before 2018, I would get into arguments with people about whether Duterte was a fascist or not, either a fascist or a populist. In December 2018, Duterte ordered the armed forces of the Philippines to destroy and kill the left in the name of law and order. He also suspended peace talks with the Communist Party, branded communists as terrorists, and established the National Task Force to End Local Communist Armed Conflict, or the NTFALC, or the NTFLAC as it's called, an anti-communist task force that continues to harass students, human rights workers, journalists, Lumad or indigenous leaders, and others. And the NTFLAC does this by tagging them as Reds or communists. On July 3, 2020, Duterte signed the Philippines Anti-Terrorism Act of 2022 and established an anti-terrorism council that can, quote, order mass arrests without warrants and detain individuals without due process, just because of any suspicion entertained by the Anti-Terrorism Council. As Filipina feminist scholars Ana Romina Guevara and Maya Arcilia put it, Duterte's misogynist fascism is now very clear, and it is defined by the laws he created and the violence he enables with presidential rhetoric. Viewing photographs of the drug war killings as visual texts of fascism enables what I hope is a critical engagement with Philippine institutions and beliefs that do the work of the violent leader. Scholars of the history of fascism have warned that focusing on the leader becomes the victory of fascist propagandists. After all, as historian Robert Paxton put it, quote, the image of the all-powerful dictator personalizes fascism and creates the false impression that we can understand fascism by scrutinizing the leader alone. As a scholar who studies culture, I wanted to understand the cultural antecedents, the possible origins of atrocity photographs that we see today. I also organized and curated Darklands as a way to support the photographers who were documenting the violence of the Philippine state, and to add Filipino images and texts as part of the scholarship on what some people are now calling a transnational or global fascism. This third section focuses on ways of reading the drug war photographs through a decolonized eye, a term I take from Filipino-American studies critic Sarita Chavez-C. In the early 21st century, Filipinx, or Filipino-American, Filipino diasporic studies scholars define empire by its afterlives, the legacies, the hauntings, and the continuities of US imperial rule. As Sarita C. put it, the cultural forms created by Filipino-American visual artists and writers illustrate how, quote, a culture survives the violence particular to the American empire. Extending C's work, I read the drug war photographs as contemporary visual texts of empire and fascism. And on this slide, you will see three texts that are important in my way of thinking, conceptualizing the decolonized eye. You have the cover of Sarita Chavez's book, The Decolonized Eye. Then there is the article by Josen Masangkay Diaz on photography that appeared in Science Journal. And then the third text is a new book that I have, that I still do not have. I am reading different parts of it from Nefertita Diar's earlier articles. And so this is a new book by Nefertita Diar, Remaindered Life. Sarita C. argues that Filipino America owes its existence to the monumentally violent and forgotten Philippine American War. Studying the visual art and the performances of Filipino American artists, C's decolonized eye traces the disavowal of imperialism. If the violence of the American Empire resulted in the destruction of Philippine languages, history, and literature, C focuses on Filipino American art and performances that invoke depictions of bodily injury and degradation. Filipino American art on bodily humiliation, pain, and humor respond to an imperial matrix of historical, psychic, and cultural dispossession by producing a grammar of violence that in turn disarticulates empire. These cultural acts of disarticulation are in fact the Filipino American artist's attempt to break up or break apart empire as an idea. Sarita C. argues that Filipino American texts respond to Filipino America's invisibility and absence in the American national imagination. And the Filipino body in Filipino American art is part of this, what she calls a combative engagement with the violence of colonization and the violence of American imperial amnesia. A decolonized eye views empire through the traumas, violence, wounding, or bodily injury of a Filipino figure. Another scholar, critic Nefertita Diar, observes that in the early 21st century, the phrase "the rule of global war" describes the current forms of global fascism, with the Philippine police as part of the American global war apparatus. She notes that in the current era, the economic globalization of capital is used for the American political military domination by means of war. Diar argues that after the US bombing of Afghanistan in 2001 and the launching of the War on Terror, the new form of the American empire is global fascism. She writes, quote, "The war on terror, the war on drugs, the war against crime, the war against poverty, these are all instantiations of the rule of war. War has become a bureaucratic matter, with the military turned into police." And lastly, cultural studies critic Josen Masangkay Diaz argues for a trans-Pacific feminist historiography for studying Duterte's fascism by linking the photographs of the drug war to the violence of US and European colonialisms and empire. Following these Filipina scholars, I argue that the work of the dead in these atrocity photographs are political and historical. Paraphrasing Azoulay, since atrocity photographs are created under disaster circumstances, a photograph pictures atrocity regardless of what it captures, even when no visible trace of the atrocity is actually left in it. And this is a quote from Azoulay. Quote, "The presence or absence of such attributes in the photograph does not change the ontological fact that when a photograph is produced in an atrocity, the photograph, is part of the picture of atrocity," end quote. A decolonized eye enables Filipino immigrant and diasporic scholars and writers to make sense of our shared disaster of being Filipino and the precarities of the afterlives of empire and fascism. Borrowing the words of Black feminist critic Christina Sharp, quote, "What does it mean to defend the dead? It means work. It is the work, hard, emotional, physical, and intellectual work that demands vigilant attendance to the needs of the dying, to ease their way, and also to the needs of the living. So in this last section, I'm following the suggestion of Black and Filipina feminist scholars to think in undisciplined, unruly, productive ways. In writing about Filipino atrocity photographs, I wanted to understand, how did I get to this? I mean, why am I drawn to this topic? And I really think this all started with growing up in the Philippines during the Marcos dictatorship, with newspapers censored by the regime. As a young person, I never saw any photographs of extrajudicial killings committed by the Marcos regime. What filled the newspapers and television were images of the beautiful Imelda, the handsome Ferdinand, and their children. And this is the reason why I have, I'm very excited by the work by feminist and Asian American studies scholars. I'm thinking of Miming Wen. I'm thinking of others who are working on the politics of beauty, because beauty and fascism are so intimately connected. So while the Marcos family would be all over the newspapers and television, there would never be any images of extrajudicial killings, or the word that we used was salvaging, an Orwellian term for the killings during the Marcos regime. And salvaging was so much a part of our lives. It was the subject of jokes. It was drawings and cartoons, etc. Beauty and terror then, as Rilke wrote, was very much a part of Filipino life under the fascist Marcos dictatorship. And now that I'm a Filipino immigrant scholar who cannot travel during the pandemic, I constantly return to the Philippines in memories, in photographs, in films and fiction. And what you see is actually the cover of an album by the Sandata Collective. It's a hip hop album that was recorded and based on the experiences of families that were victims of extrajudicial killings. What you see that is not clear is the artwork of Archie Oclos that was on the wall of a house in the slums. So now that I can't travel because of the pandemic, I return to the Philippines as a site of memory. How can we read images after disasters, after histories? How can we make sense of what media critic Dylan Rodriguez calls the Filipino condition? How our social existence is entangled with, quote, the generative legacy of genocidal contact with the United States. In my early days as a graduate student in Berkeley, I read Toni Morrison's essay, The Site of Memory. The essay, published in the anthology Inventing the Truth, was one of the early essays in African American literature that I loved. In the essay, Morrison discusses the significance of 19th century slave narratives as the source of her own fiction writing and memoir writing. The place of her art and creativity was what Black feminist scholars call the memory of slavery. And she writes, quote, all water has perfect memory and is forever trying to get back to where it was. Writers are like that, remembering where we were, what valley we ran through, what the banks were like, the light that was there, and the route back to our original place. It is emotional memory, what the nerves and skin remember, as well as how it appeared. So reading and writing about Filipino images is my way of returning to my site of memory. Since 1986 and the end of the Marcos dictatorship, writers in the Philippines and in the US returned to the period of the Marcos regime. One of the early novels written by a Filipino-American novelist novelist that featured a detail about the extrajudicial killings during the regime was the 1990 novel Dog Eaters by Jessica Hagedorn. The satirical novel's title suggests the colonial stereotype of Filipinos as dog eaters. The novel's humor and its Romana Clef narration, and by Romana Clef I mean a novel that's based on actual living characters from Philippine history. So the novel questions the notion of who is a dog eater or who is a savage. This passage from the novel is a parody of a news report of salvaging victims. A humorous detail included in this fictional news report is the name of the victim, Boy May Tubig, which literally means boy with water, since the bodies were found with marks of torture and were floating in a river. And so for those who might not be able to read the slide, it says, quote, 3 bodies, 1 headless, were found in the Macupit River earlier this week, the police said. Major Rivera said the body of a beheaded teenager had been identified as Boy May Tubig, who has been missing since Holy Week. Recently, a new generation of Filipino and Filipino-American documentary filmmakers are extending the political work of Atrocity images. The documentary called Herbanda by filmmaker P.J. Raval begins with the atrocity photograph of Jennifer Laude, a transgender Filipina murdered by a white Marine who was later pardoned by Duterte. Ramona Diaz's 1,000 Cuts focuses on the perils of journalism in a time of fascism. Her documentary follows the life of Filipina-American journalist Maria Ressa, as well as propagandists of the regime, such as Senator Bato de la Rosa. Senator de la Rosa was the general behind the drug war operations. Her documentary also focuses on the former exotic dancer turned Duterte propagandist, Mocha Uzon. An interesting and haunting documentary on the Duterte regime is the critically acclaimed documentary Aswang or Monster, directed by Alex Ain Arumpak. And this won the best film from the Philippine film industry more than a year ago. The film is creative because it uses a myth from Philippine folklore to discuss contemporary issues: the violence of poverty, the violence of the Philippine state under the Duterte government, and the violence of Duterte's drug war. These are all aswangs or monsters for Arumpak. So rather than the traditional form of documentary films that use experts, such as academics or scientists or historians, or what filmmakers would call talking heads, to explain an event or to explain an idea, Arumpak explains the horror of Filipino life under Duterte's drug war through a Philippine myth, the story of the Aswang. In the documentary, the myth of the Aswang is an allegory, a symbolic language or metaphor for the violence committed by the Duterte government against the poor. In the documentary, the monsters of contemporary Philippine society are many. A Philippine president who believes criminals and drug users are animals, the police who kill anyone, and even Manila is presented as a monster who eats the poor. But the main monster of Arumpak's documentary is Duterte's drug war. In Arumpak's Filipino Gothic, Manila is the site of social injustice caused by the extrajudicial killings, the site of soul-crushing poverty, and the site of the dehumanization experienced by the urban poor in the hands of the police. In Aswang, the monsters leave dead and mangled bodies on the streets of Manila as remainders and reminders of the Philippine state's all-out war on drugs and drug users. And this is a line from a co-written essay I wrote with my peers from Manila, Gary De Villas, and my peer, Ferdy Lopez, who is in the University of Toronto. The poor in Aswang are the disposable, indispensable collateral damage of the Philippine state's projects of modernization. And that's actually a scene from Aswang, and I began this presentation with images from Aswang, the young women who had their faces covered with paintings of faces that were crying. So I'd like to end with music. And I wanted to play the music of the Sandata Collective. And the Sandata Collective is a collective of mostly women who identify as feminist researchers. And they interviewed families who were affected by the extrajudicial killings and created hip hop songs that was recorded by several artists. Collateral, or collateral, meaning the suggesting collateral damage. Collateral is available on SoundCloud. It is also available on YouTube. The translations for the English version of the songs are also available on Twitter. So Collateral is a 12-track album, and it was released on SoundCloud in 2019. The Sandata Collective, and Sandata means weapons, didn't mean or didn't have any intentions of profiting from the album, but they wanted to receive any donations from the listeners, which they gave to the families. So I wanted to end by playing the song Distancia, or literally it means distance. And of course, that also relates to my sense of being distant from the Philippines. I have not been back for 5 years. And the song is about a migrant worker who is distant or separated from her child. So we hear her calling her child, asking how she is. And towards the end of the song, we find out that the child was killed by the police.
Nerissa, you might try clicking the link again. Nerissa?
And with that, I end. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much for a very powerful and thought-provoking lecture. I'd like to open the floor now to questions. You can type them into the chat, or if I can see you on screen and you have your hand up, I will So let's see.
Oh, I'm sorry. I saw that the music wasn't playing.
All right. So if you have a question and would like to use the hand wave emoji or type it into the chat. While we're waiting, I do have a question myself. I mean, you talked about a little bit about how you became, just thinking to yourself, how is it that these pictures and these images are drawn, you're drawn to them? Do you speak to the photographers and ask them the same questions about why they've chosen to do this and create these images and get them out there for other people to see?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for the question, Adrian. The photographers that and it's because of the digital world that we have. I'm able to speak to them despite the 13-hour difference between Manila and New York. But they really have a sense that this is something that they need to do, and there is a sense of like an activist project that is behind their commitment to photographing the horror of the drug war. So when they started as photographers, as freelancers, you know, some of them, of course, were connected to Philippine newspapers, but others, some of the night shift photographers, some of them caught the attention of international press. And so some of them have good positions, and they have excellent positions that allow them even a bigger platform for their work. I have not met them in person because I have not been able to travel for different reasons. I have not been able to go back to the Philippines since, but my co-editor, Sarita C., who has influenced me a lot in my writing, she went to meet with the photographers, and she told me that the first thing that she noticed about them was that they were all young. They were so young, and they were also very idealistic. They are not interested for us, Sarita and I, to talk about them as artists or to say anything about their lives. They're not interested in that. They want people to focus on the photographs. They don't want any attention at all to themselves. And so I think that because these are the photographers I'm working with, and they have this very clear-eyed sense of what this is about, this project. You know, this project is about documenting the horror of the state. Then that's also how I feel that, you know, that I have to look. I have to look. I have no choice not to look. So I think that looking is important. It must be something that we should do as those of us who live in the US and we are implicated in this war. You know, our tax dollars fund the regime and its violence. So I feel that we should look.
I have a follow-up question, if I may.
Of course.
Talk about the various narratives that have surrounded pictures like these throughout history, where they've gone from, you know, being these pictures portraying the brave Americans fighting abroad, and, you know, and it happens in many cultures. But you also talk about the very, you know, the narratives that go along with it. I mean, are there competing photographic narratives that are out there in the landscape in the Philippines to you know, to offset the vision and the stories that these photographers want to say about these pictures. I mean, it's one thing to talk over top of people and images and say, you know, this picture of this supposed drug dealer is the fact that we are putting this narrative on this photograph to say he's a drug dealer, he's a monster. It's one thing to say it, but are there any sort of more photographic, not necessarily film, because film is easy, but photographs are, you know, they occupy a different space when people see them and how they're presented.
So the competing narrative, because the photographers of the night shift or the night crawlers are recording the horror of the drug war, and so are there competing narratives? So a different image of the Duterte state. I suppose there are. In fact, we unfortunately, the office of the president has millions of pesos attached to its office. And so, and then of course, there is something that has been studied by scholars in media studies right now, the idea of disinformation. You know, there are troll armies that exist and are paid by the regime to make competing narratives, a competing version of the horror of the extrajudicial killings. And so, yes, there is that. It is, of course, created by the government. This has been studied by, you know, a scholar like Jonathan Ong, who he doesn't talk about photography, but he talks about the troll, you know, the troll armies of the regime. And they're still around, and I think that it is frightening that there are people that believe that the police and the military are doing a good thing, that there are people that deserve death, you know, because they either might be activists or they might have used drugs in the past, etc. All these things, you know, all the lies of the state. Yes, there are other narratives, and it remains to be seen what will happen in May 2022, this May, what will happen if the disinformation and the lies win, or we win. I don't know.
All right, we have a question in the chat. What can you say about the possibility of atrocity photographs to be used by the regime to further sow fear and terror among the people toward the project of desensitization? I'm not speaking well today.
No, thank you. Let me see. I hope I can see that question. What was that again? The question from, this is from Roma. Hi, Roma. She's from Manila. She's a writer. What can you say about the possibility of atrocity photographs be used by the regime to sow fear? Absolutely. Toward the project of desensitization. Absolutely. You are on the mark. You are absolutely right that that is the other possibility of the photographs, and how they can make people feel numb. And this has been studied by scholars of photography, that atrocity photographs can have a numbing effect. But I think that when I hear that narrative or that question, you know, when people say that, oh, you might feel numb, I think that is true, and because of the location of the questioner, I mean, she is Roma is based in Manila, and I know that I've heard this from also the photographers. I've read this, of course, photographers themselves, and even just activists who are helping the families of the victims. They are traumatic. The images can cause trauma and cause also you just shut down when you see these images. You're constantly shown it. That's possible. And I'm sure that is happening because it is being reflected by the experiences of people. And I don't know. I don't know how to address that without saying that the numbing effect can also be the other side to it, is to awaken the consciousness, to make people angry, to make people desire to organize. That's also the possibility of photography. So my worry about thinking of the effect of numbing makes me worry. What makes me worried about that is to argue for censoring such images. So that's where I'm a little hesitant to go to that direction. But yes, that is real. That is also the possibility of photographs and how they can be what scholars say that they're failed texts, because sometimes a photograph can do nothing. It might not offer any information. It might not make anyone do anything. While that is true, and I always go back to the case of the Abu Ghraib photographs that was released in 2004, when those photographs, those photographs of torture of Iraqi prisoners tortured by American soldiers, when I first saw those photographs, I was naive and I thought, oh, the war in Iraq will be over. The war will end because these photographs will make people go to the streets and organize against war. There was some organization against war. There were protests, but the United States stayed in Iraq for more than a decade. That shows you how even the most disturbing photographs that have to do with a war or a military occupation might be a failed text. It might not be able to arouse people's anger and make people organize against the leader. We could see that with the Abu Ghraib photographs that I just mentioned. However, and this is something that I've talked about with another scholar before. We talked exactly about the Abu Ghraib photographs, and I said, maybe photography is dead. Maybe photography has no purpose or use now. I mean, look what happened. The world saw the Abu Ghraib photographs and nothing happened. The United States stayed, was what occupied Iraq for a decade. And this scholar, Amy McClintock, she said, the fact that only very few photographs of the Abu Ghraib photos were released, because there are apparently hundreds of them. The more shocking ones have never been shown. And she said that she always goes back to that reality in the report about the Abu Ghraib photographs. There are photos the world has not seen because it is so shocking. And maybe this is again proof of how photography can be powerful. It can do something to threaten those in power. But I guess I can't answer that question, Roma. Thank you for the question, but I am ambivalent about photography, and I absolutely get your point. And yes, the regime is using the Duterte regime does use the photographs, by saying that these are fake, these never happened, there were no deaths. that's also the way the regime is using the photographs. Thanks for the question.
Susan Shekel had question along that vein, asking you to talk about the impact of the impact of the photos that you've shown, and that these photojournalists are creating in the Philippines. And she said she was thinking about the tremendous impact of recent photos coming out of the Ukraine, and the impact that they're having. And how do you understand the response or lack of response to these photos? I mean, just for me, the first question, my first thought is the impact has something to do with, one, who is causing who's doing the atrocities, and who the atrocities are being done to, because it's a sort of different, situation, because the United States is so close to the Philippines, and Ukraine, the Americans and the rest of the world are pretty well ready to try to put Russia in a box if they can.
Right. Yes, you're right that those are two examples, and which I mentioned in the lecture. Those are two examples of the uses of atrocity photographs. I want to focus on the question, and thanks for the question, Susan, about the Philippines. And I think that one of the positive things that has happened since these photographs have circulated, and then of course not just the photographs, the photographers themselves are getting recognition for their work. They are included in documentaries, both Philippine made as well as American and international made documentaries about the drug war. So the photographers have helped bring attention to this atrocity that has existed it's going on for 6 years since the regime has been around, from 2016 up until this year, 2022. And one of the things that has resulted from the circulation of the photographs is the ICC, the International Criminal Court. And so I think it was just a year ago when the ICC declared that that there should be an investigation of the Duterte regime and its crimes against humanity and its human rights violations. Because of the ICC ruling from a year ago, and I've asked this to the photographers, some of the photographers think that the ICC ruling has caused the police to go easy on the kings. Some still happen, but not with regularity. Like there was one evening when there were about 32 deaths, in different places in the city or something like that. So that's a positive effect. The regime is becoming aware that the world is paying attention. The world is aware of the atrocities committed by the government, the Philippine government. Another positive thing is something that immigrants here in New York and around the country are doing. They are conducting events on Zoom. Because of the pandemic, it has to be Zoom, to talk about the drug war. And also the International Committee on Human Rights in the Philippines, the ICHRP, which is a collection of different community organizations focusing on Philippine human rights, They recently, it was, I think, 2 days ago, they had a photo of all the cabinet ministers under the Duterte regime, including, of course, Duterte, and how they are demanding the ICC to pass the Magnitsky Act, which is an international law that will disallow governments who are suspected of having done atrocities or human rights violations to their citizens. These government officials cannot enter the United States, and they will also be investigated, by the ICC. So I think that that's also a good thing, that that is part of the work of the photographs. That's what I see as some positive outcomes of the circulation of the drug war photos. For the Ukraine case, I'd like to not comment so much, because I think that I'm ambivalent about what's going on, and I worry. My worry is this demand among some Americans for the United States to become involved, and that is something troubling for me if that would happen. Thank you, Susan.
All right, I have a question from Joel Saramenta from Manila. Excuse me, from Manila. The question is, meeting several international press covering the drug war killings, I have heard 2 or 3 share the observation that they think there is a lack of outrage among the Filipino people about the killings compared to what they have covered in other countries. And even 1 or 2 even commented that they can't imagine how the immediate community where the killings happened can tolerate the police going back into the area the next day. And do you have a comment? And does it indicate the photographic coverage has not been, quote unquote, sufficient to stoke public blowback against the killings?
Yeah. Hello, Joel. Thanks for the question. Joel is an old friend from Manila. And I think, and because of Joel's work he used to be with the Commission on Human Rights in the Philippines, he knows what he speaks of. But I want to push back with the idea that the slum communities who are affected by the violence of the drug war are not doing enough or not angry enough. I mean, these are communities that are impacted, heavily by the violence of the police. These are traumatized communities. So to expect communities of the urban poor to react negatively or to do something, some outward expression of anger, or say attack the police, etc. To expect that people would do that is, I think, not realistic, or that would be too much. It would be like asking a traumatized person to show anger or to do something to show outrage. I don't know if I agree with foreign journalists saying that, why aren't the communities angry enough? If they spoke Filipino, if they had access to speaking with community members, I think that they would find out that anger is expressed in different ways. or outrage is expressed in different ways. Outrage and anger can be expressed in silence, in grief, in mourning. It doesn't have to be an outward expression. And again, these are traumatized communities. So I don't agree with foreign journalists saying, why aren't the people angry enough or even expressing it? I think you see the anger during State of the Nation protests. For every year that Duterte has had his State of the Nation speech, you will see a contingent of urban poor communities taking part in the protests, burning effigies of Duterte, and taking part in the chants and the actions organized by activists. I would say that is an expression too of anger, of the community's response. So no, I don't agree with the foreign journalists that you have to deal with. Sorry, Joel.
All right, we're not going to be able to get to all the questions in the chat. I think I have time for one more, but I will make sure that Nerissa gets all the questions that were put in the chat. This is from Samuel, and he asks, do you find it to be emotionally draining for yourself or the photographers to constantly be in contact with such dreadful images and situations? What ways do you uphold your emotional well-being while amidst such disturbances?
Thank you for the question. It is emotionally draining. That was the first thing that you and I were talking about, Adrian, when you saw the slides that I shared with you. But I go back to Audre Lorde, the uses of anger. I think that mourning and grief are real emotions that happen to the photographers and sometimes to myself. But I think that I try to channel it to other ways that can help me think and process. But I also know that this is not the work of everyone. Not everybody wants to I don't think everyone would agree that an atrocity photograph is an important text or a political text. And I think that's why I'm trying to do this work. I want to tie in the realities of the past and the present so that you don't get locked in with just emotions. I think that the historical and the political is the way to understand or read these images so that it isn't just grief or rage. I don't know if I'll be successful, but this is what I'm trying to do, at least in my work. And thanks for the question.
All right, with that, I think we will wrap for the evening. Thank you so much, Nerissa, for such a wonderful talk and